Another change is probably even the biggest, and some of you folks here are close to my age, I suspect. The divisions in the Army were the driver. They had pennants, they had songs, they had histories written about them, they had proud histories. And they weren't right for the 21st century. We needed smaller elements with all kinds of support capability and lethality. And as a result, we moved from a division-based Army to a brigade-based Army where many of the brigades were interchangeable. And it's enabling our country to do things that we never could begin to do if we were still rooted in the division-based military. So there were one other thing I have to mention. When I arrived in 2001, our force structure around the world was basically where it was at the end of World War II. We were heavily in West Germany, looking for a tank attack from the Soviet Union, which no longer existed. We were heavily into South Korea, a country that was poor and in duress when we put forces there to defend it against the North and the Chinese. And by 2001, South Korea was something like the 12th or 13th largest economy on the face of the earth. And they were perfectly capable of doing vastly more. We still had troops in the Sinai, notwithstanding, left over from the Middle East War. And we were spending $236 million in Iceland for airplanes to protect against Soviet bombers. And there was no Soviet Union. It took me 4 years to get the airplanes out of Iceland. Nobody wants to change anything. That's about $1 billion, just shy of $1 billion that went wasted because we couldn't get the Icelanders, we couldn't get NATO, we couldn't get the State Department to agree. Everyone wants things the way they are. Finally, we got the planes out of Iceland. It was a minor victory, but it's saving $236 million a year. So it's those kinds of things. The most important thing I would say, however, is people. It's attitudes. And we're past a point where the Army can win a war, or the Navy can win a war, or the Air Force can win a war. They have to operate together. They have to be joint. The leverage and advantage that comes to our country by having these services able to talk to each other through communications, being able to share equipment and supply lines, being able to understand each other's tactics and techniques and procedures, it increases many-fold the capability of the United States. And that's attitudinal. So what we had to do was to find people to put in those key jobs that were joint in their heads, that understood the importance of that, and were not simply service-centric and wanting to make sure that their service prevailed, because that just doesn't work anymore. That's a long answer, but I think it's important, and the military today is vastly better than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, let me follow up on the dollars question that you raised. That has a lot of contemporary importance. So
there is the understatement of the decade.
Yeah, the president sent a budget up earlier this week. The Republicans on their side are working on an alternative budget. Given your perspective and some significant changes that you made in budgeting for defense in the time that you were there, where do you see the opportunity, if any, for savings in the Defense Department that could help with the overall deficit picture?
I was in Congress when President Johnson was president, and we had the first federal budget of $100 billion. And the country gasped. The thought of our federal government having a budget of $100 billion was stunning. What is it today? Think of it. Trillions. And the deficit is 1.6 or something trillion dollars.
Yeah.
Not the budget, the deficit. Well, what do we do about that? I mean, clearly that is threatening everyone in this room, everyone in this country, and future generations. You simply cannot spend yourself to prosperity, and it won't work. There's never a country that's done it, and trying it is a fool's errand. It seems to me that we have to ask, well, what are the big tickets? And the big tickets are entitlements. That's where it is. And until somebody is willing to step up and say that and address that, the problem will simply get worse, not better. The non-discretionary spending in the federal government's relatively small. The defense budget is I forget what it is, something like probably today 26% of the budget, and it's at a relatively low percentage of GDP. When I went to Congress in the Kennedy era, it was about 10% of the budget, defense spending. 10% of the gross national product. And today it's somewhere down under 5%. So that is not what's the problem. Now, are there places you can save in any big bureaucracy? You bet. And the Congress each year was stuffing about $10 or $12 billion a year down the Defense Department's throat that we didn't want. These were earmarks. The pet projects had nothing to do with our national security. And I mean, there's a beginning. There's at least $10 billion a year that the Defense Department shouldn't be getting and doesn't want.
So, talking about the Pentagon and the building and events in 2001, you were in the Pentagon on the morning of the 9/11 attacks. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that horrific morning?
Well, I was meeting with a group of congressmen, and they were concerned about I was trying to get them to increase the defense budget. We'd gone through about a 10-year period where the defense budget had been drawn down during the end of after the Cold War ended, and the latter part of the Herbert Walker Bush administration and the Clinton 8 years. And we were in need. The infrastructure in the department has been decaying, and airplanes were getting old. And you know, you can do that for a while, but at some point, if you need a Navy of X number of ships and they last 12, 15, 20 years, you've got to build 1/12th or 1/15th every year. Well, they didn't do that. We were building ships down in the neighborhood of 4, 5, 6, 7 ships a year instead of 10, 15 ships a year. In any event, the place was in need, and I was meeting with these congressmen saying, we've simply got to increase the defense budget. And they were worried about what was popular then. It was called the Social Security lockbox, which never, remember Al Gore talked about this? It never existed. It was a figure of speech to say, look, we've got to make sure that we make good on Social Security, which is fair enough. You have to. And so this mythical lockbox, which didn't exist, people were saying, we're going to get hurt politically if we increase the defense budget, and people will say we should have protected Social Security. The meeting ended. They got up and started to leave, and someone came in and said a plane just hit the New York World Trade Center. And everyone assumed it was an accident. And they said goodbye. I went in the next room and sat down and was getting my CIA briefing. And my military aide, Admiral Jim Bastiani, came in and said another plane has just hit the World Trade Center. Of course, at that point, it's not an accident. Something's going on. And shortly thereafter, the Pentagon shook. And we had been hit. And I remember going out to see what in the world had happened, and I got partway around the building and the smoke was so bad I went outside and came around and ran into a lieutenant colonel. I've forgotten his name. I thought I'd never forget his name because he had his name tag on, and he told me he'd seen the plane hit the building, and it was an airliner. And so I raced back up to the office and got on the phone with the president and various other people, and we began the long day of trying to figure out who had done it, what had happened. They were still pulling bodies out of the Pentagon, and it was just a terrible, terrible, terrible day for our country.
Yes.